Hello, and welcome back to the Let Me Add to That podcast. My name is Elizabeth Graswich, Executive Director of Public Affairs and Communications at the Los Angeles County Office of Education. We are the largest regional education agency in the United States. We serve 80 school districts and nearly 2 million children. We are excited to use this platform to take a deep dive into the conversations surrounding our students and schools in LA County. Today we are talking about community schools with two experts and leaders in education. I'd like to welcome our LA County Superintendent of Schools, Dr. Debra Duardo. Hi, Dr. Duardo.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning. Also joining us is UCLA Professor, author, speaker, and leader of equity and inclusion, Dr. Tyrone Howard. Welcome, Dr. Howard.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for being here. I'm so excited to get into this conversation today. We are talking about community schools. And for those who aren't familiar with community schools, can you explain how community schools differ from traditional schools?
Absolutely. You know, a lot of times people think community schools and they confuse it with alternative education or some type of different type of school setting. But really, a community school is a comprehensive high school, typically, with a real emphasis on how we provide instruction, the core educational mission, how we make sure that equity is a part of everything that we do. How do we make sure that we're partnering and collaborating and bringing resources to the school community? So that's partnering with nonprofit organizations and county departments and educators and parents and students and everybody coming together to have access to the services that students need in order to thrive at school. It's thinking about schools and children as the whole child, you know, a family, community approach to transforming how students learn and how teachers teach. And it's really rooted in community empowerment and collective impact. So much about partnering, about making sure that all students have access to high quality instruction and that people are working together to best serve our students.
I think the framing that Dr. Duardo presented is important. And what I would add to that is the fact that I think what we've learned now is that so much of what impacts student learning happens outside of school. And if we're going to support students holistically, we have to begin to be mindful and supportive of those things outside of school. So we know that there are lots of students, unfortunately, who are unhoused. We know that if students are struggling with issues such as depression or anxiety, that's going to impede learning. If students and their families are struggling with transportation, that's going to impact learning. So part of what I think community schools offer is how do we pay attention in a meaningful and thoughtful way to those factors outside of schools and think about what can we bring into the schoolhouse so that those obstacles don't impede student learning. So therefore, you bring the best and brightest resources that are already embedded in many of our communities, and we make school in some ways a one-stop shop. So if you've got young people who need certain kind of mental health services, guess what? We can have them in the school. If we have students and their families who are unhoused, but yet we have resources about vouchers for housing, there you have it at the school. If you have students who have certain medical needs that are going unaddressed, and you can provide small clinics and supports right there at the school, it becomes a one-stop shop where schools become the anchors of our communities as opposed to just sending parents and caregivers 5, 10, 15 miles away. It just feels impersonal that way. It's not always connected that way. So if we want to help students with regard to their learning, we have to try to remove as many obstacles as we possibly can that happen outside of schools. If you bring them inside of schools, you really significantly enhance the opportunities for students to learn, thrive, and grow.
And Dr. Howard, your center and UCLA have been involved in the community schools model really since the inception at LACO. Can you tell me a little bit about that involvement and commitment to it? Sure.
We recognize that this was important because the governor signed off on a historic $4 billion. That's billion with a B, $4 billion into the investment of community schools. So we wanted to be at the forefront of helping to study that and to understand that. We found that there were about 4 areas that were really important in terms of how community schools make an impact. One was expanded learning opportunities, which was huge because not everyone can always learn during the traditional school day because of work commitments or daycare commitments or whatever those commitments might be. So expanded learning opportunities are important. We also learned that community schools have done a much better job at traditional schools with regard to engaging families and communities, meaning that families feel welcome, families are aware of resources. We want families to be more connected to what's happening at school, and that's made a huge opportunity. The other thing we found is integrated services. So oftentimes what we know is that families are unaware of the fact that there might have been a mental health clinic 2 blocks away. But yet if we bring that into the school community, that makes a big difference. Or if those kind of services aren't available at the school, we can do what we call warm handoffs. And that's what the data show, warm handoffs to say, okay, we're going to give you the name and number of a person at this clinic. When you get there, tell them that you were sent from the local high school. So just awareness of and proximity to expanded learning services, integrated services was also significant. And fourth, and this is important, because we don't want folks to think, as Dr. Duardo talked about, that somehow doing community schools means that we're moving away from learning. We found that there was just a much more robust focus and emphasis on instruction, because if that instruction is going to be standards-based, culturally responsive, it helps us to recognize how we can use community resources to help support teachers who can then find a way and identify strategies and instructions to help support our students. So again, this is holistic. This is not an add-on. This is not a set-aside. This is about integration of supports and services to help students socially, emotionally, and academically.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, it's a research-based model, and it's grown so much. I mean, you mentioned the governor's investment. And Dr. Duardo, I remember coming to LACO about 5 years ago, and this was your thing. You were just getting it up and going. It was fairly new in California. And now, I mean, look where the growth is. We now have in LA County more than 460 implementation grantees, all at schools where 70% or more of the students serving are experiencing poverty and are socioeconomically disadvantaged. How do you see this equity investment being so important at a time when we're facing such difficult challenges? We're still dealing with the outcomes of the COVID pandemic and other concerns.
Well, it's absolutely essential. And we've known that for a long time. And, even before the state invested these huge historic amounts of money in community schools, we piloted it here using funds that we got from our Board of Supervisors and from private philanthropy to say we needed to do more to make sure all children had access to a high quality instructional program. And, what we found is, this huge achievement gap or opportunity gap, as I like to call it, that's existed, since the beginning of schools. And, we know that we can do better when we truly invest in all students. We make sure that parents and students and families feel comfortable at school and feel a part of the school program, that there are, as Dr. Howard already said, we're addressing the barriers that are preventing success at school. So all of those things that he talked about, whether it's a student that's hungry, that doesn't have access to health care, that doesn't have access to, a home, that doesn't have the basic things that everyone needs in order to learn and thrive and be successful. And we just knew all along that we had to do better, and not just providing integrated services, but also making sure that our instruction was, meeting the needs of all students. So, we know that the instruction has to be culturally responsive and that students see themselves and their families in the history and that they're interested in learning and that the history is accurate to begin with. And, if we empower students with that and families and they feel a real sense of belonging and that they have a voice, they're going to thrive. And we know that. We know it's not that any one group can't learn or won't do well. What we know is that we need to do a better job finding out how to best serve the students that deserve a high quality education.
Absolutely. And, Dr. Howard, you spoke to this a little bit, but just because we have you here and you are one of the experts on social justice and equity in schools, your center is the author of the Beyond the Schoolhouse project, which is an amazing project. What role does racial and social justice play in the community schools framework?
Sure. So I think what's important to note, if you're going to think about community schools, you have to think about the people in them. And the people in them come from a wide range of diverse backgrounds, ethnically, racially, culturally, linguistically. And so you can't be community-centered if you ignore or deny those aspects of who people are. And part of what we also have to recognize that the reason why we have to be equity-focused is because we know there have been particular communities, namely brown and black, who have suffered from decades, if not centuries, of historic structural racism and exclusion. So I think that equity has got to be anchored on around an idea or a concept that says, how do we offset or begin to address or just be mindful of years of segregated schools, years of underfunded schools, years of redlining, years of employment discrimination that has prevented people from being able to have access to high quality wages, years of just inferior schooling opportunities, like Dr. Duardo talked to. These are opportunity gaps that students and their families have faced. So the goal becomes, if you're going to be justice oriented, justice is always about doing the right thing for all students. But I think justice is also about being mindful of those who have historically been marginalized. Hence, you have to talk about race. You have to talk about issues of gender inequality. You have to talk about those folks who are immigrants who have been looked at as others. And so I think this doesn't happen without what I would call courageous leadership. And that's where I give Dr. Duardo significant props, because it takes a leader who's willing to take a chance, who's willing to be, unpopular at times, who's willing to take risk and say that we think this matters. We're not going to take a colorblind approach. We're going to be mindful and we're going to be culturally responsive of the needs of black and brown communities, in particular in a city, in a county such as Los Angeles, and we're going to say, what is it that we need from those communities? And again, Dr. Duardo knows she's listening. I like to refer to her as a listening leader, and listening leaders take into account what people say they want, what people say they need, not superimposing on them what we think they need, but being able to listen and hear. And I think when you think justice, you have to be mindful of the rich array of different identities that make up our county and say, how do we make schools be reflective of the communities in which we do this work?
Wow. Well, first of all, I have to say that I learned from the very, very best. So even in doing this interview today, I was like, oh my God, Dr. Tyrone Howard, he was my professor.
Yeah, she was my prize pupil, so I always take pride in that.
So he taught me so much. I had the opportunity to learn from him. And so, everything he's saying is absolutely true. And it's never just one leader or one visionary. It's all of us. It's having these difficult conversations at times, and really being honest about what's happening, how we can do better, how we can work together, how when you're really meeting the needs of all students, how it helps everyone. Everyone does better when we're making sure that our Black and Latino and non-English speakers are doing well at school. It helps everyone. So we really do need to make sure that we're doing what we know our students need. And this model, this community school model, is something that does that. It talks about not only bringing resources and services to schools, it talks about empowering students and families to have a better voice. It talks about changing the mindset of educators to really believe that every single child before them has the ability and the potential to learn and to thrive and to do well. So, all of these things are things that we know, it's evidence-based. We know that, school districts can't do this work alone, this critical, important work of investing in our most precious, if you want to call it, commodity that we have, are our children, our future. So doing it together and doing it through a model that we know works is really going to make a difference, and we're seeing that.
And when we talk about how this differs from our traditional schools, what are the specifics that community schools do that uplift the assets of Black students, families, and communities and accelerate their academic achievement?
Yeah, I think what community schools do different when done right is that they recognize that for a variety of reasons, when we see disparities in educational outcomes, we don't blame students, we don't blame families. We say, how can systems and structures work better for them? So therefore, you have to have resources and supports that are going to be mindful of that. You have to operate from an asset-based standpoint that says that if families are giving access and opportunities to supports and they're culturally responsive, they will take advantage of them and they will utilize them for the betterment of their children. And I think that's important because oftentimes folks will say, there's tons of resources in your community. It's just your fault that you haven't used them. Well, that assumes that you, A, know that they exist. That assumes, B, that you feel welcomed if you do pursue them. And C, it also operates from the standpoint that if your young people are able to access them, that they feel like they are benefiting them. And if you're not doing either one of those three, people will disengage in a heartbeat. So what community schools does, it says, listen, if we can bring those resources into the schools, we know that Black families in particular have a long history of feeling excluded and marginalized. And you begin to operate from the standpoint that you have families and parents and caregivers who love their children just like everybody else, who want the best for their children just like everyone else, but just oftentimes need to have access and opportunity. I always operate from the standpoint that people do better when they know better. And if people know that there are resources and supports that they could advocate, it makes a big difference. I'll give a quick example. So just this weekend, I spent time with a cousin of mine. She's a single parent. She's about 22, 23. She has a 4-year-old son. And I've got children of my own and a grandchild. So I've been around children enough. And just watching her son, I picked up on the fact that he was differently abled. And I asked her, what was she doing with regard to him in school? And she got kind of defensive, like many parents do, because I think the insinuation was nothing's wrong with my son. Mm-hmm. And so I had to kind of frame it in a way just to talk about how I watched how loving, how supportive, and how encouraging she was with him. But I noticed that his language development was not what we might consider typical, right? But we know this happens for lots of families from low-income backgrounds where, you may not know, you may have a hunch, you're uncertain that my child is differently abled, but you're afraid to ask for help because you think it might be a reflection on you as a parent. You're hesitant to say that perhaps there's something quote unquote wrong with my child because that might mean you're not doing your job as a mom. So I said, first of all, I watched you do a phenomenal job with your son. I said, but you should ask some questions to your local school. And she said, well, can I ask those questions? So we went through a litany of questions she could ask to just ensure that she could begin to get the kind of resources that are so important in a way that gives her son a much better opportunity to learn. So I think part of what we also have to lift up in the community schools framework is the ability to serve young people who are differently abled and to not see that as a deficit, to not see that as something that makes them less than, but to provide support and services that give them an opportunity to succeed. And I think it's not just for the students, it's also for parents and caregivers so that they feel empowered to know that they can find supports for their students. And there's nothing wrong with doing that. There's not a negative label, and it's not a reflection of them being bad parents because their children or their child needs additional supports.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that, I think absolutely that's 100% true. And as a mother of a child, an adult now with a severe disability, as a parent, as any parent, when someone tells you something seems a little off with your child, your natural reaction is to become a little defensive. Mm-hmm. But in order for parents to feel comfortable asking for help and approaching their school for help, first they have to feel safe. Mm-hmm. They have to feel that school, welcomes their input and cares about their child. And so a big part of making sure we're doing a better job serving Black students and families is to, one, make sure that they feel respected, a sense of belonging, welcome, that their voice matters, that we are here to support them, that, we see all of our students and families through a lens of not a deficit, but of all the wonderful assets that they bring to the community and what they can provide to the school. And in order to get to making people feel safe is, we have to change the mindset of all of the educators and all of the people working at a school. We have to take a close look at bias, whether it's implicit or not. We have to make sure that people are aware that we haven't done a very good job serving our Black students. Just looking at the data itself will tell you there's something wrong when one population of students is not doing as well as any other. So addressing our biases, making sure that we're empowering parents and students and everyone to come to the table and have courageous conversations and to make sure our families feel empowered to ask for what they need and they get the support that they deserve.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that leads me to another question, because, one of the things that we do look at the community schools model through the lens of involvement, right? So involving students, parents, families, staff, and decision making. What does that look like in the community schools model?
Well, I mean, it starts off with building relationships like anything. It's being very intentional about wanting to have healthy, strong relationships with all of your partners, your parents, your students, your educators, and building that trust that is necessary. And, like I said, we have a history where we have some, we have to make up for some of the things that we didn't do right. And we need to own that. And we need to be able to build those relationships and strengthen them. We need to have a place where people can come together and have conversations and really look at their school community and do some type of assessment, an assessment, a gap analysis of what's working here, what isn't working here, what would make our experience better, as parents, as students, what are some of the services that we know our community needs based on looking at our own community. And a lot of the times what people say about community schools is if you've seen one community school, you've seen one community school, because there isn't one way of running a community school, and it really is based on what the community says they need, doing that community assessment and deciding what they need. But I think it first starts with building the relationships, bringing people together to, improve the services and the instruction that's taking place there, coming up with a plan together on what they want to see, and everyone having a role on implementing that plan and being a part of it. So I think it's being, kind and welcoming and being a listener and also being a leader and saying, together we've decided this is what we want for our children, and together we're going to work at making it a reality.
And if I could add to that, I think one of the things I would add to what Dr. Duardo just lifted up, and also one of the goals of community schools, is to create these communities of care where everyone feels seen, valued, heard, and validated. And to that end, I think Dr. Duardo makes a really, really, really good point about the fact that we know that communities are going to vary. They're going to look different, and we can't use a one-size-fits-all approach. It can't be cookie-cutter, because what may work for community A may not work for community B. Mm-hmm. And I think we have to be open to that. I would also add the same thing with families, that I think communities of care recognize the diversity of families, and we need to be sensitive to and mindful of that. So there might be families where you have a single mom who's raising her children. You may have a family where you've got a grandmother who's raising children. You may have a situation where a family member who is raising children. So you're going to see and they all have deep-seated connection and care and love for their children. So we have to get out of the thinking that, a family is a nuclear, one mom, one dad, 2.5 kids. I never understood the 0.5, but anyway. But the idea being that families are going to look different, and to embrace those families through this asset-based lens, and to recognize that we want them to be involved and engaged in schools. And I think what the community schools model would ask for is, we don't want just superficial involvement with schools. We want you to be involved in decision making. We want you to be involved in some of the budget concerns, when there's governance committees, when there's school site council. We want those parents and caregivers to have a real say-so over what curriculum can look like, what kind of after-school programs might entail. And I think when you give people more responsibility and you allow them to be more engaged, they feel a sense of commitment and investment in their schools and their communities, because now they're part of the decision-making process. Mm-hmm. And they're not being told what's going to happen. They're part of what will happen. And I think that's what community schools seeks to do, is to ensure that people have real agency in what happens for the schools that their young people attend.
Yeah, and if I would add anything to that, it would be that we can't assume that we always know what's best mm-hmm. for other people. And a lot of times, if you're an educator or you have some specialized training or experience, you think that you know what's better. But no one knows a child better than their parents. And I think that it's really important for us to listen and to together come up with some very clear goals and objectives to improve the experience of that child. And we really do have to listen, parents and others, aunts and uncles and grandparents and nonprofit organizations and people that have known the community for a very, very long time. We need to listen to what other people think are some of the better approaches that we might be able to take.
Well, and you both brought up a good point that I almost want to double down on a little bit, because I think there's confusion about what actually is a community school. And I think, sometimes people think it's going to be a particular model, and that feels like that's shifted, where it's more of a philosophy with certain maybe tenets. But could you?
But you know what? But I
more?
think is key, and maybe we haven't said this yet, and that's one of the key issues about funding community schools, right? Is, schools have always done their best to provide great services and instruction to their students and families, And the challenge has been, oftentimes community would say, well, we want to help. We can provide services. We want to work with you. But the school didn't have a designated person that was responsible. So all of a sudden you have a law firm, you have a medical health clinic, you have a mental health agency over here. They're all saying, yeah, we want to help. We want to help. And who's going to do that work to coordinate that? Is it going to be the principal who's got 1,000 other things that they need to do? So what I think is the key to a community school is that base funding that provides for a community school coordinator, that it is their sole responsibility to bring these different partners together, to be that liaison between the community and the school, so that when people don't think like, oh, well, who's going to schedule the room? Who's going to send out the emails and communication so people know where to show up? But having that core person who's coordinating all of these efforts, and that requires funding. So in LACO's community school model, we not only have a community school coordinator that does all of that, but we also have like a family community case manager type person that is also working along with that case manager to coordinate all of the services, because it takes a lot of coordination. There's overlap, there's duplication of services, there's people who mix things up in rooms and schedules. So it really requires that person who's going to coordinate all of the effort and make sure, like checking back and following up to make sure that, we had this meeting and who's going to do what, and what are the follow-up actions, and making sure that that's done.
Yes, and yes, to what Dr. Duardo just said, because I think what we found in our own research, especially I'm thinking about a couple of schools in the Antelope Valley, having a community schools coordinator was a game changer, because oftentimes you have school leaders, you have teachers who are stretched beyond their wildest imagination. And so having designated persons, plural, is vital, because, for example, we know now, and we found this in our research, chronic absenteeism has been a challenge for districts all across the county and the state. But it requires that coordinator who can say, okay, well, look, we know that these number of families have been really sort of difficult to access. We're going to make phone calls. In many cases, that person will say, we're going to go knock on doors and see if we can find what can we do to get children back at school. You need a person, to Dr. Duardo's point, who is going to be responsible for that. We also found schools that had a dedicated psychiatric school social worker. Having a social worker who's aware of the different resources that exist in a particular community can be a game changer, because it helps people who just don't know where those services are. So part of what we have to move away from is some people will say, well, I went to the school, and this is a community school. It doesn't look different. I don't see a banner across the front. I don't see the painting looking different, but it's about the people. This is not about programs necessarily and policies. It's about the people who help to build those relationships with the nonprofits, with the community-based orgs, with the local church or the local mass, the different entities in a particular community who are able to say, we want to help, but you've got to have the coordinating persons who know how to reach out to people, who can speak the same language, who can say, here's what the need is. If you don't have those people, then that's why I get worried about the budget piece, because if you see any kind of scaling back of those people, then it just adds more responsibility on those folks who are already stretched thin. So yes, the community schools model is really, really at its best. Our data found, when you have designated persons who can do those jobs and do them well.
I'm so glad you added that piece, an explanation to kind of what the success model looks like. And I think one of the things that that individual can do is to tap into all of the programs and initiatives that are going on across LA County that align. And I know, Dr. Duardo, you've always spoken to the power of one LA County together on behalf of children. And so where are there alignments with other initiatives across LA County?
Well, it started off with us working with the Department of Mental Health because of the mental health crisis, during the pandemic, and we're still, experiencing that. And, making sure that our schools with the highest needs, because the community schools that we implemented are predominantly in schools with the highest poverty rates and really in highest need of having these extra resources and support. So working with resources that are already there through the Department of Mental Health and making sure our community is aware of that. There's also the California Youth Behavioral Health Initiative, and this is a huge investment in mental health and support services across the state, making sure that all families have access to mental health services and working with the medical providers to make sure that there's funding in place and there are systems in place to ensure that students have access to mental health. So it's really making sure that we're combining efforts and we're thinking about how to sustain these types of programs over a long period of time. So it's blending resources from different initiatives to make sure that we can continue, as the budget gets tighter and as we go through phases, that we have a plan in place where we can bill, Medi-Cal, for example, so that, these services are able to continue.
And, we've been talking about how great community schools are, but we also, are aware that there are challenges in implementing them. And so what are some of those challenges and how can we address them?
So I think Dr. Duardo already spoke about budget matters, right? I think the other thing we have to do is change people's perceptions and expectations of what community schools are and what they are not. I also have a concern, we found this in some of our research, that we can't use all of the same traditional metrics to define success for community schools. And so what do I mean by that? I think what happens is that folks say, okay, well, we have a community school model. That means next year, reading proficiency should go through the roof. Math proficiency should go through the roof. We'll have students in schools every day. We'll have fewer suspensions and expulsions. So people will use the traditional metrics and expect to see immediate results, but it doesn't work that way. I think if we're going to do community schools the right way, what we found is that when we determine or when we ask what success is, one of the key elements of that has to be to ask those folks in the community, does the school feel like a resource? Do you feel welcome? Do you feel valued? Do you feel seen? Do you feel heard? Because if all those things are in place first, then you set the foundation for the more traditional metrics to then take off. I think we sometimes put the cart before the horse, and I just hope that what we don't do is set up these really unrealistic and unfair expectations for what community schools need to do right away when we don't look at the deep-seated history of just what I call the accumulation of disadvantage that we know particular families have faced for years. We're trying to chip away at all those obstacles so we can make learning much more possible. So I think we have to continue to do conversations like this to help to enlighten the public about what community schools are, how they work, why they're needed, who gets best served for them. And then I think we have to talk more about what those metrics look like for us to determine what success is.
Yeah, and I think I would add, the question was with some of the challenges that
Correct.
we face, Liz. So some of the challenges are just common anytime you bring different groups and organizations together. Oftentimes we each come with our agenda, with the goals that our own organization is, really focusing on. And so it's about building those relationships, agreeing to some common goals and actions that we're going to take that we know are going to make a difference. But, sometimes, as I said, when somebody comes with their own agenda or somebody is accustomed to making all the decisions, and we're saying, no, this is about distributive leadership. This is about everybody having a voice. So, anytime you're trying to take power away from someone, that's different. Anytime someone has to do something a little bit different, that can be a challenge, and changing attitudes, and some of the challenges are just things that take time once you've developed the relationships. Sometimes it's as simple as, educators, we start really early, 7 a.m. We're at schools, we're ready to go. 7:30, first meeting, where is everybody? You're working with maybe a nonprofit organization and they're like 7:30, our first meeting is at 9 a.m.,
right.
Business hours. So, these are just some things that are all, are things that are, you're able to overcome and work out, but it's about having that good communication, building trust, finding common ground. Like, we're here for the students, listening and allowing everybody to have a voice. And sometimes those are challenging, but the longer that you stay at it and you strengthen those relationships and you have clear protocols and you're developing systems that everybody can agree on, the better things get.
Well, and even if you aren't a community school as such, just beginning to start with those relationship building, that's a great place to start, right?
Absolutely. Relationships are always the important part of this, foundational, because I think people don't know what's the saying? They don't know, okay, I'm messing this up. They don't care what you know till they know that you care.
Right.
So I think that's what this is all about.
And I think initially, too, when people didn't know what community schools, what it really meant, sometimes initially there were teachers that said, well, wait a minute, you're putting more on us. We're not social workers. We're not mental health professionals. How much more can we do? And, and so it's really, a lot of it was just educating people to understand, no, we're not asking you to do more. We know that teachers are amazing and already do and give so much of themselves. This is about how we can better support them so that they can teach. This is about bringing resources so that they don't have to be the one, trying to assess whether a student is depressed or not. So a lot of it was just communicating and sharing information so people really understood what it meant.
So we've seen this exciting investment in California and this growth of community schools. How do you see this initiative expanding and evolving into the future?
So I think we're at a really critical inflection point in public education right now. And I think it's being impacted by several different factors. And I think that community schools can kind of fill the void. And I'll tell you what I'm talking about. So one, I mentioned earlier, we're seeing significant chronic absenteeism. For a variety of reasons, young people are not showing up at schools. That being coupled with the second point, where we see declining enrollments of many children across the county. That should give us concern. And then three, we're seeing the drying up of a lot of COVID dollars across the county and across the state. So all those factors have a big impact on what schools will look like. And if I got a fourth, we've seen for years that charter schools have also played a significant role in giving parents and caregivers choice, which I think is fine to a certain degree. But I think what has happened is that more of our neighborhood schools have suffered as a result. When I was younger going to school here in Compton, there was no way my mom and dad could have not envisioned my brother and I going to the neighborhood school, because they knew the people there, they knew the principal, they knew the teachers, they knew the after school coordinators, they knew all the people. In many ways, though we didn't call it that, it was a form or a version of a community school, right? And so I think where community schools can become more attractive for lots of parents and caregivers by saying, listen, if your son or daughter comes to our school, they're going to get the kind of wraparound services that are going to help to really increase the likelihood that they can learn. We're going to ensure that we have after-school coordinators and after-school programs if that's what you need. We've got a breakfast program there in the morning. We'll make sure that your child has lunch every day. In some cases, we even see some schools even do an early dinner kind of meal where kids have food before they go home in the afternoon or early evenings. We're also going to ensure that if your child has any kind of medical needs that are unmet, that we can do what we can do to try to help meet those needs. We are now in a moment where, as public education, we have to market what we do. And I think we have to market it because now parents and caregivers have more options than they've ever had before. And I think if you see what community schools can do and what they do well, I think parents and caregivers will give a second look as to why they should not leave their neighborhood school if it's a community school, because they will say it's a value add for my son or my daughter and not something that I have to look for 20, 30 miles away from where my family lives. So I think that's where community schools can be the game changer. And that's why I think we see so much investment and so much excitement, because I think what they can do can be a game changer.
Yeah, absolutely. Great points. I think we're going to continue to learn as we go. And I think what also is really important is that we're collecting data and that we're measuring and evaluating our success. And part of that means that we are really intentional about addressing some of the issues that Dr. Howard talked about, especially around chronic absenteeism and really getting to those underlying root cause issues that are preventing students from attending school regularly. So making sure that we continue to do what we know works, measuring our success, tweaking things when we think that they need to be fixed to better meet the needs of a specific community. And, the good thing is at LACO, we really have been doing a lot of work in this and want to see every single one of our districts become districts that have community schools within them. We have been supporting our 80 districts with grant writing, with technical support so that they can continue to grow community schools. So we have 467 implementation grants this year, which is about 23% of all of the grants throughout the state. And so we're going to continue to grow, significantly. As Dr. Howard mentioned, there's billions of dollars invested in this, and we want to make sure that Los Angeles County has a huge number of schools and a greater investment in making sure we're implementing this properly.
And as we close, any final thoughts for our listeners who are either implementing community schools models or interested in getting such a model implemented in their community?
Well, I think it's important to continue to listen and learn and to understand more about what community schools are, as we've talked about. I also think it's an exciting time because I think that we're trying to figure out how we can be innovative and how do we do something different when it comes to educational delivery. I think that in many ways, what excites me about community schools is that we have the potential to be really a model for the entire nation. Because, the saying goes, as California goes, so goes the nation. I'll go one step further. As LA goes, so goes California. I know my Bay Area folks won't like that, right? But I think that here in Los Angeles County, we have the potential to really set the foundation of what this can look like. It doesn't mean we'll be perfect, but I think we're doing a lot in a lot of different parts of the county. As diverse as Los Angeles County is, the variation of what community schools can look like. I would ask parents and caregivers and policymakers to get involved and to ask questions and to not critique them, but to say, how can they be better? How do we support and serve our students better? To talk to families, how do they feel a sense of connection and engagement with schools in ways that perhaps they may not have before? So I think it's really just exciting of what can become out of community schools. And again, I give a major shout out to all the folks who are courageous leaders, such as the woman next to me who's been fearless in her leadership to say, we're going to do this and we're going to do it well. And we're going to be bold and unapologetic because we have listened to what our community members say they want and what they need. And we recognize that, and I'll close with this before I pass it to the boss. We realize this, that we cannot expect schools to address all the challenges that young people have. And that's the unfair thing we do to schools all the time. We have so many factors that impact families and children before they even step foot in schools, but yet we tell schools, you fix it, you make it right, you help our young people. And that's just grossly unfair to educators. I think what we're doing is that this requires the village to have all hands on deck. Schools can play a role, but schools should not have to play the only role. And I think community schools says, let's bring all of our resources, the best and brightest research and evidence that we have together to ensure that we give all of our young people here in Los Angeles County a fighting chance to be successful.
Wow, that was absolutely perfect. I don't know what more I can add to that. The only thing that I would say is that children spend most of their waking hours at school. Let's capture them where they're at. And if we have the opportunity to partner with all of the nonprofit organizations, the churches, the community, the parents, educators, county departments, state departments. I mean, if we could all come together in our communities and really focus on what's most important, and that's making sure we're meeting the needs of our students. And Dr. Howard said it better than anyone else. these are difficult times. Children and students are facing, drug issues with fentanyl, something we haven't ever seen in my lifetime at this, rate of overdoses and dangers, mental health crisis, all of the issues with technology and how much time children spend on their devices, poverty, housing, lack of health care. I mean, these are things that impact whole communities, and usually low-income communities of color. And to expect one school or one school district to solve these systemic issues that have existed, for a very, very long time, it's just unrealistic. So coming together and really focusing on what's most important, and that's our children, and seeing them thrive and do well, is what we want to see and what we'll continue to strive for, as we implement and continue to grow the community school program.
Well, I want to thank you, Dr. Duardo and Dr. Howard, for joining us today, as well as for your bold actions and commitment to our nearly 2 million students in LA County. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you want more info on LACO Community Schools, visit laco.edu.
Please follow the Los Angeles County Office of Education on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter at Los Angeles COE. That's Los Angeles COE. Or you can find us on Facebook and LinkedIn at Los Angeles County Office of Education.